Welcome Psych 364 students. This is my somewhat delayed week 3 commentary in our fall 2016 course together. This week is a important reading week in terms of the work of Linda Brannon, one of the great gender psychology figures in the field today. I've asked you to read 2 of her chapters because we're looking now in our last 2 weeks in the study of masculinity at the issue of the biological basis of the male gender. And this is a difficult subject matter, but I think it's also a very rewarding one. This is also an important week insofar as I'd like to distinguish my own perspective in degree from that of Kilmartin and Smiley. And the reasons for that we can discuss online at the discussion board or elsewhere if you like. In short, I want to start by referring you to page 41 in the Kilmartin text and the work of the great Sandra Bem, who in the middle of the last century began writing on gender schema and gender role theory. And her four-square representation of male, female, androgyny, and abstinent or asexual representations of masculinity, I think, are an important starting point in our discussion. Now, needless to say, these have been somewhat eclipsed as the last 50 years we've been looking at, quote, doing gender and the issues, the constructionist perspective on the issues of gender in general and certainly masculinity in particular. I would like to suggest that the question of an essentialist perspective versus a constructionist perspective is a case where perhaps the question itself is not well crafted. And by that I mean it's my belief that taking a dimensional perspective, or if you would, a spectrum perspective, looking at masculinity is a useful emerging paradigm and one that is widely embraced in the field of men's studies today. Note, this does not preclude either extreme, meaning there being an essential masculinity and there being an essential truth to the construction of masculinity in each culture. How can this be so? Well, my comparison would be, clumsy as it might be, with the question of, is a house made of bricks or walls? And in part, that's a matter of emphasis and perception. So I think in reading the work of Linda Brannon this week, you'll get a good idea about what's called dimorphism, which is from the field of biology. And needless to say, biology has a strong interest in looking at sexuality per se, but also biology is very helpful in our discussion of gender as something that is a matter of differentiation rather than a matter of categories. So dimorphism basically paints a picture of differentiation prenatally and fundamentally based on genetic foundations. But that is not to say that biology leads to unique categories, but rather that it sets a direction and a process of differentiation in place. And hence, the detection of differences is possible but one has to look more deeply at the magnitude of the differences, the significance of the differences in terms of the expression of gender, in order to appreciate the process of dimorphic development. So all that to be said, I think this perspective will provide some rather convincing evidence that differentiation is the norm, but that does not mean, again, two distinct or unique outcomes. So I want you to look at these two chapters. I want you to, in a sense, struggle with them because they don't teach down to you, but rather they give you a very solid grounding in what we know about specifically prenatal development and the role of both chromosomes and, I might add, hormones prenatally. And this will connect with Smiley and Kilmartin's work in terms of the expression of gender in the neonatal and stages thereafter of the development of individuals. So again, I want to stress that I don't see these as competing constructs, but rather converging constructs in our understanding of gender. I might add this viewpoint is very consistent with the concept of gender fluidity that is front and center in gender studies as far as gender identity is concerned. And we'll come back to this issue of gender identity later on. But now we really are looking at the issues of masculinity and asking, can we see it from a combined, in other words, a both and, essentialist and constructivist perspective? I know that's a more complicated idea, but I think that's what the science points to, as well as the studies, if you really read them carefully, the kind of qualifiers that are put into the portrayals of this difficult question and the positions that one might take. Now, again, referencing Kilmartin and Smiley, which I have here with me, let me take you to chapter 3, which is the focus of this week. And I'll point out that the organization of the chapter is worth taking a close look at, insofar as these authors do acknowledge temperament as an important foundation for the differentiation process of all individuals, either within genders, between genders, or across genders. That being said, the first part really only looks at the biological abnormalities associated with gender. It then goes on and makes a good case for a constructivist point of view, and it highlights the psychoanalytic tradition. And just a word about the psychoanalytic tradition, if I might. It's odd, and this is frankly where I would differ from the work of Kilmartin and Smiley. It's odd to insert a discussion of the psychoanalytic perspective, which after all relies on subjective report. It's odd to include this in a chapter on biological contributions. And so I would suggest that we look at this actually as two chapters in one. And the psychoanalytic tradition, which is a very rich and actually wonderful perspective in its own right, has much to tell us about gender identity and the subjective experience of gender, as opposed to the biology of gender. And indeed, in the phenomenological world, these two cannot be completely separated, but from the point of view of appreciating multiple perspectives on gender, I think these are worth teasing apart, if only to get conceptual clarity in our work. So, again, in short, I'm suggesting that you look at the section of chapter 3 on the child inside the man, or the psychoanalytic perspective, as actually a separate chapter. That being said, I would encourage you to look closely at the work of Nancy Chodorow, Chorodw, Chodorow. Her work is certainly more contemporary than either Freud's or even the neo-Freudians of the early or the middle and the latter part of the 20th century. Nancy Chodorow is a fine researcher and clinician who talked about the developmental experiences, note experience, not biology, the experiences of men and boys as well as girls and women. So more on that on the discussion board, because I fear I'm getting long-winded. My hope this week in week 3 is that you'll take a deep dive into Brannon's work and appreciate the concept of dimorphism and differentiation prenatally, and specifically the complex roles of both genes, and by that I'm of course alluding to the XY assignment of males, and hormones. And the hormones of course shape not only such obvious things as genitalia, but also such subtle things as the timing and sequence of other systems of the body. So look at the role of hormones, but don't fall into the trap of thinking about hormones simply as differentiating sexual organs. Also look at the role in terms of the timing and degree in the triggering of development of other functional systems of the body. And then it'll be a good week. And then next week, in week 4, our final look at masculinities, I will extend this commentary and look at the work of chapter 4 in Kilmartin and Smiley's work. So I think that's enough for today, and then I'll again continue this line of discussion next week.